Russian President Vladimir Putin says Moscow is prepared to resume peace negotiations with Ukraine, and his remarks come at a time when Ukraine claims a series of diplomatic and military gains, including long-range strikes deep inside Russian territory. But Putin also underlined his conditions. Any future talks must be based on the Istanbul framework of 2022, as well as what he called the current realities on the battlefield.
Russia is ready for peace negotiations with Ukraine on the basis of the agreements reached earlier in Istanbul, which, I remind you, were initiated by the Ukrainian delegation at the time. That means everything suited them. I see no grounds for us to depart from these agreements. But this should be on the basis of the agreements reached in Istanbul, on the basis of the modalities discussed in Anchorage, and most importantly, on the basis of the realities on the ground.
The Russian president also accused Kyiv of trying to improve its negotiating position through attacks inside Russia, but insisted that developments on the ground tell a different story.
Everything done about it by the Kyiv regime that I have just mentioned is aimed at one thing only. It is to create favorable conditions for themselves should the peace talks that were interrupted by Ukraine start or rather resume. They want to enter talks from so-called position of strength. What kind of position of strength? At most, this could be about creating the impression of such a position, because the realities on the battlefield look entirely different.
Well, Ukraine has in recent months expanded its deep strike campaign, targeting infrastructure far from the front lines. Earlier this month, drone attacks targeted energy facilities in and around Moscow, with images showing large fires and plumes of smoke coming from a refinery. On the other hand, Kyiv has also intensified operations around Crimea as part of its strategy to disrupt Russian logistics and isolate the peninsula. Russian-appointed authorities in Crimea said recent drone strikes caused widespread power disruptions in parts of the region. Well, the Ukrainian attacks on Russian refineries have indeed forced Moscow to ban exports of gasoline and jet fuel. It is also considering a diesel export ban, with reports even hinting of possible fuel imports to tackle shortages, especially in Crimea. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has praised his country's strike forces for what he called precise operations, arguing that the campaign is increasing pressure on Russia and raising questions about the cost of the war.
The majority in Russia is already complaining to Putin that this war has no end in sight. All the current difficulties for the Russians should bring them closer to the idea that this is their war. It is not just a stone from the sky, and that their war must end.
The Istanbul agreements refer to a draft peace framework negotiated between Russia and Ukraine in 2022. The proposals envisioned Ukraine renouncing NATO membership in return for security guarantees while leaving the status of Crimea and parts of Donbas to further negotiations. Now, Putin also referred to understandings discussed last year in Anchorage, Alaska, between Putin and US President Trump. Russia claims that these understandings involved freezing the front lines and limiting Western military support for Ukraine. Now, Ukraine has consistently rejected any settlement that requires territorial concessions, but much has changed since that meeting. Moscow now says the United States of ceasing to be an impartial mediator, arguing that Washington has moved away from what Russia describes as the spirit of the Anchorage understandings.